Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 556 of Constructive Criticism. I'm your host, Easy, and I'm joined by my co-host, Abe Stein.
That's me.
And Mason Clark.
That's a me.
It's a Mario. So today is an interesting day for the podcast as we have probably our first real mega rankings type episode in a long time where there were pretty legitimately important events. So I want to kind of talk. Last time we changed the way the power rankings work. I just want to let people know kind of what a power rankings episode is and how it works. So we originally had a point system based off of Frank Karsten's article that ranked things according to match wins. With a little bit more things for winning the event, but we have streamlined it to 3 points for a top 8, 2 points for a top 16, and 1 point for a top 32. We have 4 events included in our power rankings today. These are standard events, and we have the Japanese, I think it's Japanese and Korea Champions Cup RC, the MTG Southeast Asia Championship RC, the Brazilian RC, and the US RC in Minneapolis as the 4 events that got points for today's episode. And we're going to dive into the data of the decks that performed the best, getting those top 32 finishes. Obviously, this does not include everybody that made the Pro Tour. It doesn't even include everybody that cashed, but it is, it is the barriers that we historically had made in Magic that mattered that we are using, and I'm pretty excited to dive into this. Before we do, though, I wanted to talk about the worst. I want to talk about the format. The 21 different decks got points. Mason, is that a high or low number in your mind?
It's a pretty high number. I mean, especially for a standard format.
I know that I think we talked about this last week about how this format's pretty large. So it was pretty impressive for Izzet to take over. But I was shocked to see 21 decks. Abe, do you feel like that number is high, low?
I mean, it's definitely a high number. I think that, it's interesting. I think it's really reflective of 2 things. One, that there are, obviously just a lot of ways in Standard to attack the format. I think there's a lot of different variations on different color combinations that play similarly in a big sense, and then differently depending on how they're constructed and, what their configurations are and how that kind of defines them. But 2, that right in that, I think that mid-range being the space that is the least defined and the most attractive in terms of metagame positioning, when you have an aggro deck that is seemingly the best deck, leads to a lot of diversity in decks you have, right? When the problems are pretty defined, the solutions can be pretty wide.
Yeah, and I tried to be pretty this fits into this archetype pretty consistently. There were some examples where I was all right, a blue, I think there was one deck version of blue-white Oculus that was not playing red. And I was you know what, that's enough to make this a different deck. That's, you're removing a whole color. You're probably removing almost 20 cards from your 75. But overall, I tried really hard on this one to really just say no, even if the decks are 10 cards off, this is the space, and we're still early in the standard format, which is why we're seeing so much variation between deck lists. And 21 seemed pretty high to me, legitimately. Abe, do you know what the worst performing deck that got points was?
Yeah, it was Otters. Your favorite.
So first of all, I love Otters. But I I did not expect to see a lot of otters getting points, and from what I can tell, like the people that played otters actually did pretty well, but it still had the lowest finish among decks that got points. I'm curious to see people registering this deck with prowess and other like blue-red decks available. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, Mason, before we kind of go into the power rankings.
I mean, I think like otters is a different type of deck, so they don't feel like the same spot to me. Maybe you can, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the otters deck. In my mind, I'm thinking the Valley Flood Caller sort of combo-y deck that was there kind of pre-Duskmourn. And I think that, like, you know, something like that's appealing if you think people are going to play a lot of these, like, if you think everyone's going to switch off and play like these slow interactive decks to try to beat Cutter, then playing a deck that can like, oops, I win, but still have some game to it. I could understand the appeal. I don't think that's like a very realistic thing to have happen, but I could see how someone gets there. Plus, it's just really fun. You know, like there might be some people who are just kind of like, yeah, like, I don't know what to play. I own these cards. It's a good time. That is something that does occur at some of these RCs. So, you know.
Yeah, I also know that Jason Yee was working on otters and did wind up playing the deck in Minneapolis. Did not make day 2, I believe, but did put out like content regarding the deck, updates to the deck, was even working on it, streaming the deck leading into the RC. So I wouldn't be surprised if some number of players who either did play it were working directly with Jason, and therefore were, you know, I assume players of pretty high caliber compared to the field, or were, you know, armed with good information, or were just dedicated to the deck. I mean, I know that's a deck that kind of over now several turns of the format has always been kind of a background presence. So it's, you know, Otters is as dead as the Otters players want it to be.
Let's go into the power rankings. Coming in 8th place, the 8th best deck in Standard, according to these power rankings, with 4.02% of total points available, 9 total points, and 6 different decks getting points, which should tell you something, is Mono Black Demons. This is a deck that we actually talked about on last week's show, that from some win percentage data that's come out, actually had a really, really good weekend. Just not a ton of people played it. Kind of curious your guys' thoughts on the deck.
I played it some after, well, like we had talked on the pod, and I heard some other people talking about it, and so I kind of, you know, played a couple of games of it or whatever, and it was fine. Like, it was sort of my experience. Like, there are some times where, oh, I forget its name, the Quasari Revenant, the Vampire Nighthawk that you can like flash back from your graveyard to like give something lifelink Death Touch. Like, there were times where that card was really good, and I was like, holy cow, I am gaining a lot of life. This is really hard to beat. My duress is lined up perfectly. You know, like, this is a great spot. And there were other times where I really felt like I would struggle against just, you know, like the cards stock up out of any deck, you know? And it felt sort of like a good deck, I guess, is sort of my endpoint on it. Where one that I didn't feel I would personally love to play right now, all things considered, but it definitely wasn't bad by any means, you know? And it felt also too like I could see some optimization. Like, I don't know what that would be, but I could totally believe you told me that you changed like 6 cards in the Demons deck and it came out a lot better. Like, that would not be something that I would be skeptical of, you know? So
yeah, I feel like this deck, in my experience with it, because I did try it out for the podcast, really lived and died by how good Imitation Tactics, Duress, and Deep Cavern Bat ended up being for you in individual games, not even just in matchups. And, you know, if you had talked to us a year ago, I think most of us would have said Deep Cavern Bat was the literal best card in Standard not that long ago. And to have the format shift so much, I think it's really interesting. And I also think that, like, you know, this deck gets to have some amount of power just on the Unholy Annex aspect of the deck. One thing that I was looking at is not a lot of lists playing like Liliana to like recoup and like stay ahead. very much just trying to close the game out quickly with demons was kind of the consensus build that people came to.
Yeah, but I think when we were talking about it last week, I kind of mentioned that like my vision of the format at a really high level was just the games were really condensed in the early game. And I think that Mono Black gets pieces of that right. Like you were saying, Bat, Duress, intimidation tactics, those are all great ways to poke a hole in the early game development of your opponent and generate some space, right? I mean, taking a Corey Steel Cutter out of the hand of prowess when it's the threat they're really leaning on, really like taking away the critical mass of things or even like shredding apart the hand of like a deck like Omniscience, that can be really hard for them to come back from just several discard spells, but followed up by pressure, and then having just the biggest haymakers that you can have with a very low ability to stumble because your deck is just swamps for the most part. Like your mana base is very clean. Your mana requirements are very, very easy to hit, unlike decks like Pixie or even Oculus, where you're relying on a lot more of actually contending in the early game. Like all of that is a recipe for success. That is a way to attack the format that can be successful. I don't know if it's the best way to do it, but it certainly makes sense to me that deck, in the hands of the pilots who did well with it, was able to put up wins. It's not a deck I would rule out if it was something that I felt good about playing.
I'm really glad you brought up the Pixie thing, because like there is in preparing for this event, there was like some pretty big conversations about not wanting to play three colored Painland mana bases going into this event. And this deck not only doesn't do that, it's just like I take no damage from my lands, none of my lands enter tapped. The only thing you have to worry about is drawing too many colorless sources. Like that's it. So, I don't know. Next deck coming in with one more point at 10 points was Zero Domain, coming in with almost 4.5% of total points available, 8 different decks representing the deck, and getting the lowest finish on our power rankings of decks that got points that made it in 13th. I'm not convinced that this deck still doesn't have a pretty good place in the meta. But I'm kind of curious what you guys think about how it's really hard to build this deck and compete with like something like Omni combo, which we'll get into later, while also competing with the low to the ground decks. It's almost like you're fighting a losing battle, but if you can figure it out, or if you hit the right spread, like it's really good. It just so happens that one of those decks vastly overperformed, I think, compared to what people are expecting this weekend.
Yeah, I don't know how you feel about this, Mason, but I definitely felt like Domain's strength prior to Dragons was that it was able to be bigger than all of the mid-range options and have a serviceable game plan against aggro. I don't know that the format exists in such a way that there's enough of that middle ground for Domain to be preying on in the same way it used to. I think that speaks to your point too, Spencer, of like it's how do you cover all of your bases? How do you cover the fact there's combo decks? There's these decks that demand you to play a lot of lockdowns. And then there's this span of decks between that also kind of inherently are coming prepared for what you're trying to do. But I definitely, I'm not surprised to see the deck do well. I think just having a deck that has a lot of card advantage and a nut draw and efficient removal, like that catches all and is able to play Cop's Temporary Lockdown is a deck that can contend in the format. But I don't know, Mason, if you have opinions otherwise about like Zur and kind of its decline since the Pro Tour.
No, yeah, I think what you said is true. Like the fact that it kind of went bigger than everyone, and sort of it's just hard for Zur. Like it has like that kind of free-ish win draw, right? Like if you're on the play and you go Beans, Green Overlord, Zur, there's a lot of decks that just can't beat that, right? Like even the cutter deck, if it doesn't have like a really good draw, struggles against those sort of things. And I had a friend who like I watched her play like the finals of like one of the Moto challenges where she won on Friday with the Zur deck. And our kind of takeaway from the end of it was like, you really shouldn't be playing this deck. It was like we won and we were like, yeah, this isn't a great deck compared to some other choices. But once again, it's like a totally fine deck and it does a lot of powerful things. But in comparison, I think to some of the top decks, it's lacking a little bit. And the format's just sped up so much more. And the mid-range decks, I think, are still have some issues with Zur out muscling them, but it's gotten a lot closer now. Like Zur didn't really move at all in the last set release, and all the other decks kind of took a step forward, and some of them were really big steps. So that's going to kind of my thoughts on Zur. If you love Zur, I don't think it's the worst deck you could be playing this next weekend, but I'm not high on it either.
Can we talk about decks that we're not high on? And that's the deck that won the the USRC. Let's talk some Jeskai control. This deck came in with 12 points, so 2 more. 5.36% of total points available. Just 10 decks finishing, or sorry, 9 decks finishing. 7.03% of 7.03% of total decks. But it did have a highest finish of 1. I was low on this deck going into this event. Playing with and against and watching the deck, I don't know, like sometimes like your draws line up really well and you do have a really good 2-mana counterspell if you choose to play it. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I think this is the worst deck in our power rankings. Like I actually think it's pretty bad. I will be interested to see how the win percentages show for this deck, because I think that it I have not seen it performing well personally, and I know the others have also not. So
sure, yeah. Sorry, you go, Abe.
I was just gonna ask, what specifically about the deck doesn't impress you? Like, what makes you feel like it's the worst deck of all of these?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of what you said about Demons, of like it has an ability to play the early game in like specific ways, and this deck just gets out mana leveraged by like most decks in the format. The thing that it does really well is the dragon. Sorry, I'm gonna just pull up the name of the dragon really quick. Because I do think sorry, what's that?
Shinko, the 5-mana dragon.
Yeah, I didn't want to get it wrong. Shinko is pretty good. Like the card is like the fact that I think the number of times that I have forgotten that card has vigilance is the number of times my opponents forgot that Primeval Titan had trample. And that card's really good. My worry is like you're playing like Lightning Helix and 3 steps ahead in a format that is like much faster than that, and that's my concern. Is that the game? Obviously, the games where like temporary lockdown are good, and you can, pressure advantages. The deck does very well, but like that would be true of any of like that would be true of Domain. That would be true of. We're going to talk about a deck we're going to talk about other decks that's true of. This deck does not pass the mana check, in my opinion. I think that its mana can be pretty rough, and you're forced into playing. The deck that won played 5 3-mana sweepers. So like, yeah, it's definitely trying to compete on that axis that we're talking about, but it's not like these cards aren't able to be played around. I don't know. Did that answer your question, Abe?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear your thoughts on that. I'm a little bit higher on Jeskai than you are, because I think that, like you said, they like have to play that many 3-mana sweepers to keep up. I think framing it for me is like they get to play that many cards that are answers to the default of the format. They get to have a game plan that's able to support playing that. and they're still playing some of the best cards in stock up. Shiko's very strong, very good at turning the corner because it is also representing just another stock up, or another lockdown in the case it gets destroyed, or I think there's a lot of upside to the deck that at least makes it feel better than the worst deck of all of these. I think that in terms of being one of the better lockdown decks available to you, that is a boon to me. As far as one of the pillars of the format, this is one of the best ways to accomplish that. Whether or not that's actively good and whether that's the best way to approach the format, I think that's up for debate and discussion. But I think between that and also being able to pack the cards that are effective against kind of the other ends of the format, because you are just playing a lot of sweepers, you're able to devote more of your game plan to beating decks that are not in the aggressive lane. I don't hate its positioning, but that might just be me. I'm also a bit of an apologist for control decks personally, and I love a good
especially
Goblin Dark Dwellers or Dark Dwellers,
specifically Jeskai.
I do think this deck is better than mono black, for example. I think they're trying to do similar things. I think this is better at consistently executing it, because a lot of the mono black deck, I think you accurately nailed, Spencer, of how good was my discard this game at actually keeping them off their thing for a while. And even against decks like Corey Steelcutter, it's just hard if you don't close the door quick enough.
Yeah.
Right? Which I think is part of why you actually see, because I felt very similar to you at first with the Liliana the Veil. I was like, oh, this feels like a card I want, but after playing, it's oh, I would like this card, but I have to end the game because I don't have the tools to kind of keep up. And I think this deck actually does a better job of kind of stopping somebody and then making sure they don't rebuild from there and actually closing the game out at the same time. So I'm not super high on Jeskai Control personally. I think it's a fine, you're gonna hear this a lot tonight. I think it's a fine deck. It's not where I would want to be, but I can understand how someone gets there. And I also think base is a really powerful card that we didn't talk enough about, that has been a big part of Standard since its release, always in these controlling shells. But that's a really powerful card too to stabilize when you're all right, lock down you, all right, Beza, okay, I've gained a little bit of life back, I've got this big thing, and it kills very quickly. It's very easy to have Beza be your win condition. So yeah.
I think especially when backed up by a Shiko, if your curve is counterspell or tap land, counterspell or Helix, lockdown, or even just another tap land, lockdown, Beza to stabilize, Shiko copying your 2 or 3 mana spell, whatever, that's a pretty hard curve for a lot of decks to beat. You do have, unlike a lot of control decks past, you do have a game plan where you're playing to the board to get ahead, even in the matchups where you're naturally a bit behind.
Yeah, and Meringue River Region, I think, does a great job too of being something that helps you close the door on those curves. If you do, you just interact some, and then your big draw spell actually doubles as a pretty realistic win condition. You play that, a lot of the removal that people are playing to counteract these other decks does not answer Meringue very well, and a 6/7 just kills super quickly, right? So play that, bounce them, hit them hard.
I do think that the fact that other decks outside of this deck play this card does speak to it's got that Lockhorn Whale treatment, even though it is a little bit different. But I do think the card's really good.
Yeah, I actually thought about putting Lockhorn Whale in the deck. I think Shinko makes you want to not do it, but I definitely flirted with that idea too.
Yeah. So. Let's go into our 5th place deck. 15 points. This is when we start seeing some jumps, making up 6.7% of decks, 10 deck total count, and 7.8% of total decks. Its highest finish only being 2nd, though. Unlike the previous deck, it did not get a win. And that's Jeskai Oculus. I think this deck is really good. In preparing for this event with people, we had this huge whiteboard that we did, and when ranking our top decks and then decks that we hadn't played, I said I have not played this deck, but I think that it is possibly the best deck in the format if built correctly, which I don't feel about a lot of the decks on here. Last week we talked about mono red and how I think that maybe That's the thing, or is it prowess and stuff like that? But like, Jeskai Oculus did very well at the American RC, and I don't know its play percentage of the other ones, but it was mostly carried by the American RC. I think the deck is quite good. I think it plays the best cards per capita of like cards in any of these decks, other than maybe Mono Red does that. I don't know. But I think the deck's very good. I don't think that if you're going to Hartford, I don't think you should be ashamed playing it. If you have a good list, a good plan, I think that it probably has pretty good matchup spread. Yeah, I think it's just a solid deck, and we're getting to like just good decks now as we go up these power rankings.
I'll step in and say I'm a little surprised at how medium this performance is comparative to where I placed this deck personally. Like in my mind, if you're not going to play Cutter, the first in line is this deck. Like, you know, spoilers, I'm team Cutter pretty hard. And I think this deck is like the first, like, okay, you're not going to do that. This is where I would go. And I don't think it's like some huge fall off either. It's not like we're talking, you know, some like Energy versus Underworld Breach in the last RC like step between the decks. I think it is a really good deck that's really proactive and really good at doing a lot of things that matter in the format. One of the things I've found as I've coached more people and watched people play is the deck is, I mean, it's obvious the deck is very difficult when you play it, but it is like sometimes if you make like the wrong choice, it can like totally sewer your game. Because you are sometimes playing on like very thin margins. And so I think that's one of the things that this maybe, you know, a confirmation biasing myself a bit here, right? I have this narrative, I see this happen, but I think this deck kind of underperformed a little bit. I would have guessed, you know, that it would have probably been like in our third or fourth. So not huge, you know, like it's just not that big a difference between these placements there, but enough that I kind of felt worth mentioning because Jeskai Oculus is a really strong deck in my opinion. And a deck that I think is very, very good.
I just like legitimately playing against it, testing different decks, preparing for this event, and helping people was just constant. Like, oh man, like I don't know how I ever beat that draw. I don't know how I ever beat that draw. Like the decks were just eliminated out of contention by this deck. More than they were eliminated by prowess, more than they were eliminated by Zur or Jeskai Control. Like this deck was just eliminated. Like you actually don't have any draw that can be this deck, and other people are gonna know that. Like it's not hard. It's not hard to see. Like it happens so fast. And we kind of saw that at the Pro Tour. Not that long ago, but like they had other problems. But I think that like the Mako helps a ton. Just like getting to have like a big blocker or a big attacker in matchups. I think the deck is very good.
Yeah, I'm with Mason. I think I was a bit surprised to see it this low. I think that the deck's biggest strength is that it's the mid-range deck that's able to present the, like, it has the most texture to it, right? You can have draws that are really dominant in the early game with, like, fast oculi, or you can play these kind of longer games where you see a lot of your deck because of fear of missing out, because of Steam Core, because I'm like with props, you have a lot of ways to generate a lot of traction and see a lot of cards and play some pretty interesting longer games while also having the short games available to you. I think that's pretty unique to Oculus in terms of like it operates at a pretty linear clip of like it's able to put out the same level of power at a large range of the game. I do wonder if, like, to Mason's point about the deck being pretty punishing, that had an effect. You know, like when, especially if you're, right, really intently testing the deck and you're focusing on the matchup and you're really learning it, like, from either end, there's a lot of times where maybe you learn something that changes the way you approach the matchup, or maybe people came into the deck less experienced with it than other things, or just found themselves kind of the difficulty of the deck and the amount of decisions you have to make being more punishing than maybe the deck's performance in kind of a vacuum looks like it should be, or like we felt like it should be coming out of last week. But I definitely would say that this is like number 5 on this list will surprise you. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of crazy to think that was like, I think for all of us, like a number 2 or number 3 deck, maybe even a number 1 deck for some of us, but not seeing it perform the numbers there.
I will say that we are all Americans, and it did have a very, very good performance of the American RC. Like, what our expected meta was did support this deck pretty well. Next up at number 4, get into the top 4 with 18 points, 8.04% of the total points, and 11 decks. We're getting into a lot of 11 decks here in a second. He's mono red, and this was kind of like our talking point last week. If you like listened and were like, oh, what do you guys think of, like, is it prowess, mono red, Jeskai, oculus? Like, those were kind of the 3 decks that we talked about. I think that this fits exactly where I expected it to fit. I expected players to play less of this. I think that the deck has, like I said earlier on the podcast, like just a lot of good cards per capita. Just a very strong deck that asks a specific question, and I think that we are in an ask question format, and it does good. It does good at that. Yeah, I don't know.
Did y'all see that Ryan Condon posted on Blue Sky, stop buying my sideboard guide for this deck? I wouldn't endorse playing it.
Yes, I did see that.
Yeah.
I just want to put that out there for the listener. If you didn't see that, is mono red still a playable deck? I think so. I mean, the results, I think, prove it. But if you have access to, I wouldn't say it's got a chance of being better than Izzet in its own way. It's not the best aggro deck in the format anymore. I think we have to be pretty open about that. But it certainly is. I mean, it was top dog for a reason coming into the release of Tarkir, and so to see it still, a set of really powerful cards, like you said, just quality cards per capita is an aggressive deck with these cards that generate a lot of value is still, it'll still score. It's not the worst.
I think it's funny that you could just look at a mono red list in this form and be like, oh, those are all good cards. Like, yeah, that's just all good cards. And oh, go ahead, Mason. You don't agree?
No, you said that a couple times. I just think all the good decks are basically all good cards, minus the black deck. Like, the black deck is the one that's like, wow, I can't believe I'm playing this card. You know what I mean? Like there is no card in Izzet Prowess that I wouldn't register in a Pioneer deck.
Here's the thing. We're about to getting into Omni combo and Dimir mid, and I don't agree on those.
Sure. Well, I sort of mean I don't know. I think Dimir mid range, it's much more positional. I think a lot of their cards are fine. I don't think they're Pioneer good, but I do think that we are in a really strong standard form.
Oh yeah,
I don't know
absolutely.
how you all feel about that, but yeah, I think if you were a standard player and your locals had a Pioneer tournament, you could pick up lots of the Oculus deck, for example. You could go and play, and it's worse than if you upgraded your deck for Pioneer. But if you told me you 2-2'd or 3-1'd, I would not bat an eye. I'd be like, yeah, your deck's really good. I think there's a lot of strong cards, and I feel the same way about mono red. I am pretty high on mono red. It's up on my list, probably below Omni in my mind, which is where it lands here as well, because you haven't heard the name Omni yet. But the deck is just full of good cards, and I feel there's no card. I don't know. Maybe this is just we're at a weird point in history, or maybe I'm just more aware of it right now. But I do feel every deck I'm just God, that card is really good.
Yeah.
There's nothing that I'm really scratching my head about.
Let's talk about Omni combo. It does come in at number 3 with 20 points. I told multiple people to play this deck. I was like, I think this deck's really good. I don't think people are prepared for it. I kind of hinted at that on the podcast last week. I think this deck is really good, and also does not take a ton of reps to play, and also just kind of crushes certain parts of the format where they have actually no chance of beating it. And I think that it is the reason that we see Zero Domain at number 7, because I think that it has is one of those decks that has no shot. I think this deck's really good. I think that the conversations that I've seen around this deck are very interesting about like how you sideboard, when you sideboard. I think the deck's just super powerful, and I wouldn't bat an eye if anybody told me that they were playing this in Hartford.
I know a few people who have already talked about maybe switching over to this from like playing Izzet, just on the vibes of like the deck continues to perform really well and is kind of a sidestep from what people are expecting out of the format. I will say, in my experience playing it, which I did put in some time with it this week, it feels like it has a bit of a folds to itself issue. Like, you don't just put in omniscience and play and win all the time. There is a bit of like surfing to it where you've got to have that plus the card draw, and like a lot of the times I felt like I was lucky to win because my opponent didn't have like a single piece of interaction, and I had to have the untapped lands locked down, like a discard. Like there are a lot of things that have to go right for you to win in some of the more important matchups in the format right now, and I think there is an amount of like losing to yourself that I don't really like to tolerate out of the decks. But I will say, in open deck lists specifically, I do have a favoring towards playing combo decks if you can, and if they are on the list of things that are playable, because you get such an advantage with knowing your opponent's hate and sideboard plans compared to playing it in the dark. So I say all that to say, like, it is a good deck. If you really don't feel like you're comfortable playing something else, it is one that you can probably get a lot of the ins and outs of within a week or less of testing if you're really intentional about it and you're comfortable playing combo decks. But I don't know, I'm not quite as high on it as you, Spencer, personally. I think it's got a few issues to work out. Even if it does perform pretty well in open deck list, it's not the choice for me, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, Abe, but I do think in my mind it's sort of third in line with like, is it Oculus, Omni? I do think it's probably a step below the first two in my personal opinion. But I think it gets a lot of edge on the fact that you hinted at, like, it's sidestepping what a lot of the game is about, right? Like, it has cards that matter in these matchups, but also it's asking different things of players, especially in game one. And I think that is really powerful. And like you said, like that open deck list, you get to sort of attack and pivot to what they're doing a little bit better and have a bit more information. So I really like this deck in that regard. I do think I would maybe struggle playing this at like an RCQ, for example, where it's like closed deck list and things are a little different. But for the RC, I really like this sort of deck.
I think that, like, what you just said, Mason, where you get it, like, you write 5 rules of engagement down for this format, right? And you're like, oh, this deck ignores this one, and ignores this one, is like, oh, okay, so I now get to only, like, I'm reducing my problem quite a bit. I think that this deck gets to do that. I think there's a reason, I will say this, there's a reason that I think this deck did better than Jeskai control, and I will be interested to see how the data supports that, because I would guess Jeskai control was probably more played than Omni combo. So,
well, don't we know that from the data you posted? Like the percentage of total decks, Omni was 8. And
that's just the
Jeskai
point.
was...
That's just the number of decks that got points.
Oh, okay. I thought that was like
no
total of all the fields.
Oh man,
gotcha.
Yeah, I didn't have that much time. Come on, Mason. Let's talk about.
Well, I mean, you just add them all together, but yeah.
Okay, let's talk about number 2. It's Dimir mid. It also comes in with 20 points. Does anyone like this deck in this format? Like, on this cast?
I want to frame it a different way, because last week we literally all said we were low on the deck, right?
Yeah.
And we were all like, we'll be surprised this does well next week.
And it
did
did.
well. Yeah, so I kind of think it's a reflection moment of where do we think we went wrong, and let's not have the cop out answer of a lot of people played it, because I think that's part of it. A lot of people like this sort of deck, but like a lot of people playing a deck doesn't necessarily means it converts well, right? There has to be something to it. Like if a lot of people played the insert whatever you think the worst deck is, it's not like it's going to convert this way every time.
Sure.
So there has to be some strong element. So I guess like my question is really, what are the good things about Dimir? Because we spent the whole last week just kind of dunking on it.
I think that in games where you are in the driver's seat, it is uniquely positioned to control that driver's seat against a lot of the field. And we kind of talked about how like Jeskai control kind of does that sometimes, right? This deck, when it becomes in the driver's seat, like when it's like, okay, now I'm in charge of the tempo, the gameplay, the things, like it does good at that. We had a podcast listener who's like, I wish I had played Esper Pixie at this instead of Jeskai Oculus. I just never would have had time to play Jeskai Oculus. And I was like, well, if that's true, like you should have just played Dimir Mid. You also know that deck really well. It did really well the week before. And like, if you were worried about getting punished for playing Oculus, like, staying in that lane and like playing what is clearly the better performing deck was could have been the answer. And I think that happened for a lot of people. We talked about this last week about like Golgari, Mono Black, and Dimir as like these black mid-range decks that people could play. And I think that the Dimir has been a good choice for a long time, and people have a lot of experience with it. And I think it lifted it. I want to be clear that its data did not come from the USRC. Its data almost exclusively actually came from the smaller RCs. So I just want to be clear about that.
Okay. Yeah, I think one thing that I might say, which is a little echoing of last week, that I think you point out, Spencer, which is a really good astute point, that like it's very much like the level 3 deck of like level 1 is Cutter, level 2 is temp lockdown deck that's kind of clunky, to beat up on Cutter. Level 3 is play my Dimir mid-range deck. I kind of beat up on that level 2, and I'm not totally dead to, the Izzet Cutter deck, but I'm definitely not favored. And I think that is probably very appealing to a lot of people, and probably is where I would guess a lot of the matchup power where points came from in this deck. I don't know if
there's something to be said, and I don't think I appreciated this enough in thinking about the format in the games, is that the Dimir deck is equipped with a lot of cards, and kind of like parallel to what you said, Spencer, about the deck being really good at like being it, like getting into the driver's seat, and then once it is staying there, is that in games that break down away from plan A's, like the consistency in game plan and like synergy in the mid to late stages of the game that Dimir has, like those have been really impressive to me in games that have broken down beyond like those plan A's. It may not be the best deck out of the gate. It may in fact be outclassed in what is, at least in my opinion, the most important stage of the game right now for the format. But that still doesn't mean that every game goes that way, just because it's the most important stage. And I would feel comfortable saying that I feel like Dimir is the deck that is strongest at like, the game is going to go past turn 3, like, or past turn 4 or 5. Things are kind of not going according to plan for the opponent for one reason or another. It may not be the best at punching that hole, but there are definitely draws where I've played against prowess where they, play a couple creatures or a steel cutter, or like have to stock up on turn 3 or stock up on 4 and aren't really playing a land and a spell. Like there are just things that can happen where the deck isn't firing on all cylinders, and so the game does drag out a little bit longer. And once it does, the advantage bar shifts pretty heavily in Dimir's favor, because now the mana advantage that is inherently baked into the more efficient cards isn't really as important to the Dimir player, who has a lot of haymakers that, including like Enduring Curiosity, can be cast at instant speed, or ways to like effectively two-spell and use its mana really wisely and start to catch up. So I think that in talking about it last week, Mason, you asked like what do we think we got wrong? I think I just didn't give enough consideration to that reality of the format, and like you said, the kind of level 3 effect of the decks that weren't these top 1 or 2 decks in the format that are really streamlined and focused on that early game, playing into the strengths of Dimir. I do think though that like the numbers for Izzet prowess at the American RC and just in like play rate being as high as they are is a very big alarm. Like if I were considering playing Dimir, I would consider it very alarming, because that matchup is so tough, and I think that you can't
muscle your way out of
ignore
it.
That.
You can't muscle your way out of it. I was just double checking the data from Spain. And Dimir midrange's very, very worst matchup, according to the data that Frank Garson gave us, was Izzet prowess. We talked about that on the show last week. And I'm not like the data is everything, like only listen to the data type of guy. Like, I think that you could change 10 cards in your deck and change a matchup quite significantly. I think there's an inherent problem with this matchup, though, that I don't know is fixable. And in looking at deck lists as I was making these power rankings, I think there was a lot of dodging that happened, and I know, Mason, you didn't want me to say this, but I do think that like this deck was probably overplayed for a lot.
Well, it was less I don't want you to say it, and more I don't want to lead on it. You know what I mean? Like there are other things. It's not, there has to be more to it than that. And I think we did do a good job covering all those things. I think it is important to say that like it's good to acknowledge that there are people who just like certain types of decks. And I talked about it in coaching a bunch that like, the RC 2 weeks ago gave the blue-black sickos the green light to play their deck. They're like, yes, Dimir, Kaito, they saw it did good, and that gave them the confidence they needed. Whether they should or they shouldn't, up to time to tell. I know where I stand, and I've made it pretty clear.
I think that like if there was a lot of mono red, I haven't looked at the data. I think that like there's a lot of things that you can do well. Kaito's just a heck of a card, first of all. Like let's be clear. That card's probably swinging percentages all over the place, but well, we buried the lead, 65 points, 29.02% of total points.
It's more than the last 3 decks combined. If you combine second, third, and fourth.
Almost more. Yeah.
No, it is more.
Yeah, it is more. I was gonna say almost more than the next 4.
Sure.
Here's the thing, man. Was it the most played deck by a lot? Yes. By a lot. Across all of the RCs. I didn't know that there were that many Corey Steelcutters in existence, Abe. Like, I didn't actually know they had printed that many.
A Corey Steelcutter behind every blade of grass, Spencer.
Here's the thing. I think a lot of data is going to come out that said this deck underperformed somehow. I think that there will be data that's like, oh yeah, like it's percentage lessened from day 1 to day 2. It had these losing matchups and blah 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 blah. From a power rankings perspective, this is the best performing deck since Green White Tokens, as far as my soft memory can confirm. And I know that Green White Tokens never got banned because a new set came in and kicked it out, but it was the most dominant deck that we had since Callblade when it was in Standard. I don't know. I think that the craziest thing about all of this is that there's not even close to a consensus build on this deck. There are people that are like, no Monastery Swift Spears. There are people that are like no slick shot show offs. There are people that like people are all over the spectrum on what this deck is and needs to be and how it works. You know, it was really funny. We had like a whole conversation about like the number of, actually I think that it was also said on coverage, the number of stock ups. And I was like, this is useless data. Like, there's no way. Your plan is more important than the number of stocks you play, and like the number of stocks you play should be according to your plan. And I'm impressed. Like, it was a very known quantity, and if you weren't playing it, you had to have a reason. So that's my thought.
I mean, here's the thing too. There's a big innovation with like people really realizing that Into the Flood Maw is good in every matchup and solves a lot of your big problems. It is good in the mirror. It is good against all the lockdown decks. It is good against Oculus. It is good against Omniscience. There is no matchup where the card is bad. You want to main deck it. Unironically, you might just main deck Unsummon in this deck. You know, like that would be on the edge, but it's not unreasonable. And Unsummon that solves basically a lot of your sideboard issues that you want for the mirror and one of the most played decks in Magic history recently at RCs. It's like that solved a lot of things. And I don't blame anyone who missed the memo in the week between that, like Into the Flood Maw was the truth. That's fine. You're going into Hartford now. Your temporary lockdown plans are not solid enough to win. We saw plenty of times on coverage where, you know, end of turn, you do something and like you did something on your turn, excuse me, I bounce your temporary lockdown and I kill you. We saw plenty of times where there's one match where the player's at like 24-ish life. Corey or Jim is talking about how, you know, they're in such a good spot and you can beat this deck, and then they die on the next turn. You know, like the deck is so good. It is so efficient. And like I said earlier, there's no cards that I'm unhappy to be playing. I'm basically playing a Pioneer deck. My cards are more mana efficient than everyone else's because they're all 1 and 2 or stock up. And a lot of my 1 and 2 mana cards are more efficient than the 3 or 4 mana cards other people are playing. It's just a hard recipe to beat. And the best part is you're proactive. Like, you are actually ending games. A friend of mine, Brente, you know, I was watching him play his winning in, and he was on the play in the mirror. And his opponent, I think, mulled to 6 and had to like cast a cantrip on one, but he went like, you know, turn 1 cantrip, turn 2 cutter, turn 3 cutter cantrip. And I was like, how do you ever lose? Your opponent has to kill everything forever. They're on the back foot. And, you know, the next turn, the guy had to like play stock up and pray, and he died, obviously, you know, and even if he hadn't died, what was he going to do? You know, it's just so hard. And your deck that goes long, but is also super fast, but is also, you know, able to play multiple different game plans. It's just very, very good. It is my number one deck with a bullet. There are other decks that are good, that are fine choices, but I really like this deck.
I think it's funny that you mentioned Into Flood Maw because I had deck lists that had, is it Bounce Off that bounces the vehicle? I think it is. I had one Bounce Off, one Into the Flood Maw during like most of my testing for like different reasons. Part of it was like Bounce Off gets to be a protection spell for like your slick shots and stuff like that. And once I saw Drake Hatcher and like kind of like after our podcast last week where we talked about like, oh, the mono black demons deck like presents really big bodies that are hard to deal with. I was like, okay, well, like if that's the actual biggest concern is like dealing with a big body, then like who cares if I protected my own stuff? Like, let's just get this stuff out of the way and go. Anyway, I thought that was astute, Mason.
When games contain 10 mana of expenditure on both sides at most, unsummoning your 4 mana play or your 3 mana play is a lot. And so yeah, no, I'm definitely with Mason. I think this deck is just the card Core Steel Cutter is a pretty hard problem to solve. It's pretty hard. It's a pretty big question to answer.
No, everybody
and
just, just play a braid. Just play a braid.
Yeah. I'll get on it. You know, it's also just like I'm not going to get into the Treasure Cruise problem, but like all the cards that are best against it are best with it, with the exception of Temporary Lockdown. I think if you're playing a lockdown deck, it makes sense. I think that's like, you know, but you have to target a way to win this. You can't just
We
And
should
you're
do,
a deck that
we should do a
you're
Patreon.
so happy to.
Go ahead.
I would say you're just happy to draw your 5th or 6th land in your aggro deck too. Like I draw my 5th or 6th land, and I'm like, yippee! You know, like I like it's so often not that big a deal.
Yeah, oh, I've got 5 mana. Now I get to stock up and cast 2 good spells.
Yeah.
I get to do the whole thing. Or like, oh, I'll buy back something and cast it.
I think that
Wild.
a lot of my opponents that I've played against forget this card equips. Like, you could just move it.
Yeah.
Like, that's just 2 mana you can use. So it's also a mana sink that people forget about.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just a lot, and like the fact that I think I mentioned this last week, but like your best 1-drop play is also your best turn 5 and turn 6 play quite often if things are going bad is really messed up.
Yeah.
Like obviously there are better things I could do on that amount of mana if my game's going well, but if my opponent does the thing they're supposed to do and stops me in a non-temporary lockdown way, my 1-drop play picks up my stock up that whiffed, unluckily, and now I'm running it back again. And they have to be interacting with all my things and killing me. And that's the thing that, like I mentioned is nice about Beza and Shinko and Moraine River region is like these cards do close the game. Their bodies are really big and they sort of, they have some high impact so that even if they do get into the Flood Mob, there's something to them in comparison to a card like Archfiend of the Dross, for example, or the Kwasai Reven, the Nighthawk variant in Standard. And that's part of where like my dislike of the black deck comes in a little bit. But it is just so hard to actually stop this deck and consistently stop it. And also, like, so often, a lot of times, like, someone has lockdown 3, on the draw, and the Izzet player just kind of got to not extend everything because they didn't need to. And then they do something like Swift Spear, Sleight of Hand, other thing, put you to 4-ish, Burst Lightning's lethal for the rest of the game, along with a million other things, and it's like, you did everything right. You interacted along the curve. You had your lockdown when you're supposed to, and it just doesn't matter. And then if you're not playing a non-lockdown deck, you can't keep up with the card advantage that Corey still kind of provides. Like your Dimir deck and your mono black deck just have a really hard time actually beating a resolved Corey Steelcutter. And your deck plays all the cantrips, which are just like more of your creatures and more of your burn. It's just really hard. Yeah. And you get to see all your sideboard cards every game because you see all these things and everyone that stops you is slow, right? The only exception is Omni. But in the Omni matchups, your Spell Pierces and other soft permission spells like Negate and Stroke cover those really well. And even
your removal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and your removal does it too. And like if they go for the combo, the thing that you stops the combo also stops you from dying. So if on turn 4 they don't have Abuelos with a Temple Lockdown, you have a lot of information to look and be like, actually, I'm going to Spell Pierce here and I'm going to cast Stock Up. And if I hit either Rage or Burst, they're dead.
And like, clear, this is why I hate everybody that's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna just like, I think that Slickshot Show Off is bad in the deck because what you're describing is like exactly why I think it's so good in the deck. Is it's like, okay, like, deal with this, and then it's like a double-edged sword. It's like, all right, well, good job, now you're dead. The deck just has all of it. Like it really does.
Yeah, and it's really good, and I feel irresponsible not telling you that your first choice should be this deck. This deck is so good, I am considering going to Hartford, even though I haven't practiced a ton, because it is so good. And I'm like, oh, I should maybe be going to this event, because this deck is great, and this is like I didn't play the Breach RCs, because I was commentating them. But, like, I'm not commentating this one, so I should maybe play when there's this broken deck that's, like, very clearly the best and people keep deluding themselves into things that don't make sense. I don't know. To me, this is a very clear, you struggle in deck selection and you want to be a special snowflake moment. And there's all these little things that you can go about, but this deck is so good. Everyone who I convinced in coaching to play this deck last weekend, who was against it before, all qualified for the Pro Tour.
That's wonderful.
All of them people who had never qualified for the Pro Tour before. Small data point, not the main thing. I'm just simply saying, like, a lot of first-time PT invites went to this deck. Shout out Kobe, for example. So, yeah.
That is going to do it for the power rankings. I think that we talked about what we got wrong, what we got right, what we learned. I guess the last point before we wrap up. Where do you go from here, Abe?
I go to Hartford, Connecticut with with the prowess cards in my hand.
Mason.
I'm asking Abe if I can sleep on his floor, and I'm messaging you all to see if we need to maybe switch next week's episode to not be a standard recap, unless things really change. You know.
Yeah, I like I said, I think some people are gonna like lie to themselves with some data that's gonna come out this week about its numbers going down. Unlike last week where they went up. I think that it's the best deck. I think that Draycatcher and Into the Flood Maw are the truth, and I think you should play this deck in Hartford. And unless you break it, like, you know, good job if you do that, but, you know, you have to actually do that. So, if you enjoy the show and want to support us, head on over to patreon.com/ccmtg. Become a patron like Adrian C., our newest patron. Adrian, we just want to give you a special shout out. Thanks for joining us. Adrian joined the $5 or more tier, which means he gets access to the Patreon Discord. So thank you so much, Adrian. We appreciate you. Also, if you're in that tier, that $5 or more tier, you get access to the Patreon question. A little part of the Discord where Matt R asks, how do you discern meaningful data on good decks and matchups for so many different recent results? Oh man, I feel like we talked about this a little bit on this podcast, but I'll let you go first, Mason.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about it on the pod. I think it's important to look at like sample size. Remember that like the way people play things matters a lot. And so a good sort of first impression is sort of being like, assuming everyone kind of comes at things, you know, from a very baseline level, what do things look like, excuse me. And it's important to note like the shapes of like the decks and like what their plans were. So like, you know, maybe this week, as a random example, let's say Orzhov Pixie did not do well versus Izzet Cutter, but the week before it had, well, paying attention to sort of like, okay, what changed about the Cutter list? Because either one, you just have two extremes of data, right? Where maybe you have an outlier in one of those spots, or something big changed along the way. And so a big thing that I look at for the data is one, like, does this make sense with like sort of what I think about things, and like, what is this telling me? Like, how is this challenging me? And like trying, like what I mentioned with Dimir here, and be like, okay, I thought this, data is telling me this other thing that's counter that. What could be the good about this? What am I maybe missing? And trying to solve that sort of thing. And I think it's also just like when you have large sample sizes, you know, you can get a pretty good idea for deck matchup. And remembering that like the larger something gets, the more likely it is probably to get towards 50%, right? Like a more people play something, the more chances there are for it to kind of like lose and player error, right? Because maybe then like if only Javier Dominguez plays the deck versus all of us playing it, the win rate's probably lower because Javier is much better, right? So there is some amount of that. But I kind of just look at, you know, data like the Izzet Cutter. I'm like, wow, it's the most played deck and it's positive in a bunch of matchups, and including overall. That's a good sign, because there have been times in the past where even the most played deck goes under because it isn't as strong as maybe perception has it be. So data's weird. Don't look into it too much. I mean, for example, 17 lands is kind of nonsense, right? Like, what's the highest winning card when cast? It's the Falter effects, because you only cast those when you win. But, you know, when looking at the big picture data, just go in there with like trying to figure out how is this helpful and take it with like a grain of salt.
I'd like to just expand on that. I think that like understanding the type of data that you're looking at, and I'll just use the power rankings as an example. The power rankings is not there to tell you what deck to play. The entire point of the power rankings is to say, here are the decks that you need to prepare against, the things that you need to have plans for. And that is different data than matchup data, than win percentage data. Those are just different things. And so when we had a lot of data that we used to make the power rankings today. But the information that you should be getting out of it is, here are the 8 best performing decks from the weekend, the things that people will most likely consider, and now where do I go with that information? Not, oh, Izzet's number 1, so I should play Izzet. That's actually, I mean, we did say that, but like that's not what we're saying. We are presenting you with, here were the best performing decks, here are the things that people are most likely to move forward with, do with that info what you will, Abe.
Yeah, I think that just in general, when you think about data, like interpreting data, there's a lot of different ways you can read the same thing. I think that's like one of the most obvious things, right? There are trends within data that exist. Interpreting those trends and telling the story of them is kind of the skill that a lot of people have. I think it's important to not read too much into any singular storyline, but if you're really working with the data in a productive and intelligent way, it's best to understand what those stories are and what your takeaways from that data are, be it about a specific matchup, be it about a deck's performance, whether it's overperformed, underperformed, etc., and then line it up with other evidence as well, supporting or detracting from those storylines to say, okay, does this really make sense? Is this the reality of things, or is this something that maybe upon further examination and looking into the what I'm aware of or what it is that I believe, or even others believe, or whatever the other objective truths you have access to are, support or don't support those claims. I think that's like the most important thing you can do. And especially when you have multiple different events where maybe you have conflicting conclusions from data, like the most important thing is to ask yourself, what stories could I tell from this data? Don't just go with what it supports in terms of like, oh, well, the deck I'm going to play did well in this matchup, and so I'm going to play it. It's like, well, why do you expect that to happen based on the data? And is that the only thing you could take away, right? What supports the contrary, and can you also apply that same scrutiny that you would to those points that you're kind of erasing away within the data in your interpretation? Do those hold up, right? Do those hold water? I think it's about really trying to balance your perspective and using it as a way to interpret what's happening in the format as a whole, but not let it dictate for you what's happening in the format as a whole. It just gives you some insight into things for you to look into further and evaluate further, and then inform your testing for the next event.
I love it. Thank you so much, Matt, for the question. Over check out our sponsors at untapped.gg. I used them a bunch this week in just playing Pioneer as I was refamiliarizing myself with the format, and also I used them a bunch. I think I mentioned this last week. Like, I didn't realize that they had gameplay on premium accounts, so you can replay and watch your games, so that it just recorded. So use the link in the description if you're looking to play Arena. They're great. Like, they really are. There's a reason they're the #1 deck tracker, and also just having that replay value and stuff like that is pretty amazing. And then don't forget to use the code CCMTG3 this month at Mana Traders. You can once again use the link in the description below. Mana Traders is the reason some of my friends even play Magic. Like, it is that important. I know that Fire Shoots has been talking a lot about kind of the arena economy, the arena price structure, like the things like that, and Magic Online just remains to be pretty amazing. And we appreciate Mana Traders for helping us out. And then if you want a mug that I still have downstairs that I gotta send before I move to Abe, head on over to the swag store. You can find it on the YouTube channel as well as in the description. However, always improving is the point of the show. If you're not getting better, you're getting worse is what we used to say. But Mason, what did you do to be always improving this week?
Yeah, so I mean, this week I just kind of really challenged myself to like make sure I'm getting done the things that I want to get done that put me on the right path before I do like fun stuff, right? So a good example of this is like I want to wake up in the morning, I want to work out, so I'm making sure that I'm going to bed at a time that's conducive to that, and I'm actually, getting up and doing it and knowing that I'll be happier in the long term if I continue to do these sort of things. So there's a lot of things in that vein, and really just holding myself accountable. Less Magic related, you could argue playing Izzet Cutter as one of those things, but that's more of a joke than a serious thing. And so yeah, that's where I kind of was sort of making sure I'm doing the things that I know I want, that long term matter, even though short term maybe Mason much rather watch the rehearsal episode now than in a couple hours.
Dude, I love that. I'm gonna actually just mix up the show notes and piggyback off of that because, Star Wars Day was this week, and I had a lot of fun on Sunday. But I actually found multiple opportunities to do the most important thing in my life, which was be a better dad. And I'll just talk about this for just a second. Like it's really hard to be a good dad. It's actually like a really hard job when you think about it. Maxwell had a really hard day yesterday and Saturday, just both really hard days. And yesterday, during his hard day, had to go pick him up from soccer practice because he was having a hard time, and he's sobbing, and I'm like, "What's wrong?" He's like, "You're mad at me." I'm like, "I'm not mad at you. Everybody has hard days. It's hard. Like it's hard to have a hard day, and we're gonna go home. We're gonna hang out, and we can talk about it later." And one of the things that I realized today is that I need to give myself that kind of grace sometimes. And I need to not just do this in like life, but like in Magic, I feel like we often don't do this. We don't give ourselves grace when we probably rightfully deserve that grace. And it made me think a lot today as I was just playing games for fun about like, okay, like, did I do the best thing possible? No. Was I trying to? Also no. Maybe I could have been better there. And then to forgive myself for that, and then make the adjustment in the next game. I actually had that happen in a match today. And I think that, like, giving yourself grace in a moment is something that you have to learn as a parent for your kids. But I don't know why we ever give that up for ourselves. I don't think that we deserve that. I don't think that we need to do it. And the last 3 days specifically have taught me that a lot. So
I don't know that mine is exactly on the same theme, but I think it's definitely a kind of bigger picture thing. This is a lesson that I learned from, or really internalized from playing Valorant a few years ago. But just like decisiveness and like executing plans is so important to me and how I function in order to be able to succeed at high levels and perform. I've had a really, really crazy month and a half at work, being short-staffed as a manager, especially in a retail space. I've had new employees I'm training. I've still got all the same things on my plate. I also, in my personal life, just have, the plethora of things that everyone has to manage in their own personal life, but also with just certain economic realities, like have had to make some pretty big decisions around, like I just got a new car, traded in my old car that I had for like 10 years plus to get a new one. Like I had to make a lot of big moves and also have the RC coming up and also the PT coming up. So to kind of paint a picture of where I'm at. But what I did for myself this week is I set short-term goals and timeframes on them, like to-do lists of what I was going to get done in the night, when it was I wanted this done by. So if I didn't get to something, I knew how to prioritize for the next day, and took the time to like really plan this out during, kind of like out loud to myself, during my drive to and from work. And because of that, have been able to stay on top of most everything I was working on. Like behind the scenes, I was able to commit to my Pro Tour team for Vegas, able to get the car, able to figure out everything with work, and stay on top of things with my job, able to run all my errands, keep everything in shape, and also be on a good timeline to have everything figured out for myself by Hartford, which, you know, if I asked myself literally a week ago today, none of this was figured out or in the works. Like, I hadn't even started looking at cars. I hadn't even, you know, gotten to the point where I knew I was going to be able to commit to the testing team I'm working with, which will be Sanctival again. There was just a lot of things in the air, and so I think just knowing that I have that skill and knowing that I learned this lesson about myself in terms of how to perform my best, and then taking the step to do it, is something that I need to do more often in Magic. I think I kind of alluded to it a couple episodes ago with like setting up my mentality and like my play space and removing my distractions with playing Moto, but like giving myself the opportunity to, and leaning on those things I know, like I knew that this would be the best way to do it, and just doing it rather than you know, kind of just doing whatever, but actually focusing on trying to be in a high performance situation and enabling myself rather than just kind of letting things happen, because I knew that I wouldn't get the best outcome with that included.
I gotta do that with my move. I love it, man. You can join the conversation by going over to patreon.com/CCMPG. Come into Patreon to join the Discord at $5 or more. There's also a public Discord for all of He's the Game Media. You can check that out. Links in the show notes. And then one of the best ways to support the show is just to leave a YouTube comment. Just head on over, leave a little comment, let us know, like, subscribe. Mason, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. Find me at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. If you want to reach out for coaching, you can do that via Twitter DMs or my email, masonclark@gmail.com. Put coach in the description. And if you want to watch some coverage action with me, I'll be commentating the NRG this weekend, a little modern standard action. So you can check me out on their Twitch channel. Abe, where can people find you?
You can find me over at Blue Sky at More Nothings or Twitter at More Nothings. I will not be doing any coaching between now and after the Pro Tour. So if you'd like to get in my books for after that, feel free to reach out. But unfortunately, anyone who is looking for coaching, I'd have to direct you to someone else. So.
Find me at Spencer13H on Blue Sky as well as on Threads, and He's a Game on Twitter. Thank you everybody so much for listening this week. Thank you guys so much for joining me on the podcast. I really enjoyed it. We'll see y'all next week with a brand new episode of Constructed Racism.
Magic.